Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're taking another plunge into the unknown with a new compilation of unsettling stories. Each tale will take you deeper into the darkness, where reality and fear intertwine. As you listen, I want to know, have you ever had a moment where you felt like something was watching you but nothing was there? Share your story in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these dark journeys, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss what's next. Now let's dive in. The Vanishing Trail. My name's Evan, and I used to be a private investigator. Used to be, because after what happened a few years ago, I left the job and never looked back. This story takes place in Seattle, though the city itself wasn't really the problem. It was the trail outside it. I was hired by a woman named Karen Thompson, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense type. She walked into my office on a rainy afternoon, said her brother had been missing for 6 months, and the police had stopped looking. "His name is Dean," she told me, pushing a photo across my desk. "Last anyone heard, he was going for a hike on Rattlesnake Ridge. I need you to find out what happened." Rattlesnake Ridge was just outside Seattle, a popular spot for hikers. The police had combed the area when Dean first disappeared but found nothing. No signs of a struggle, no gear, not even footprints. Karen insisted Dean wasn't the type to just vanish. I took the case because honestly I needed the money, but I had no idea what I was walking into. I started by retracing Dean's steps. I talked to the ranger who had logged Dean's entry into the park that day. He confirmed Dean had signed in at the trailhead, but that was the last official record of him. "A lot of people come through here," the ranger had shrugged. "Sometimes people get lost, but the park's not big enough for someone to just disappear." I knew better than that. People disappeared all the time, even in familiar places. What stuck with me was that there were no signs at all. No abandoned car, no dropped equipment. It was like Dean had been erased. I drove out to Rattlesnake Ridge on a cool fall morning, pulling into the empty parking lot. The trail wasn't too difficult, but it was long and winding, surrounded by dense woods. As I started walking, I noticed something strange. There were markers every few hundred feet, small wooden signs nailed to trees, with numbers scratched into them. 3, 5, 8. They weren't mile markers, and there was no pattern I could figure out. I hiked for about an hour, my footsteps the only sound. As the trees closed in around me, the sky grew darker, the air colder. I wasn't far from the summit when I saw it. A small clearing off the main trail, hidden by a line of thick brush. Something about it pulled me in. The clearing was empty except for one thing, a rusted metal pole, about 5 feet tall, standing in the center like some kind of forgotten monument. I walked up to it, ran my hand over the cold surface. There were scratches on it, like something had scraped against the metal repeatedly, and then I noticed the ground around it was uneven, like it had been dug up and filled in again. My stomach churned. This wasn't right. I pulled out my phone to take a photo, but as I lined up the shot, I noticed something even more bizarre. Off in the distance, just barely visible through the trees, was another metal pole. Same size, same rusted look. It was almost like a trail of them. I followed the second pole, then the third, moving deeper into the woods, away from the main trail. The poles were spaced out like some sort of twisted guideposts, but there were no other signs. No animal tracks, no birds, nothing. Just those poles. Finally, I reached a dead end, an old, decrepit cabin hidden behind a thick layer of vines and branches. It didn't look like it had been touched in years, but as I got closer, I saw the door was slightly ajar. Against my better judgment, I pushed it open. The inside was as you'd expect, damp, moldy, falling apart. But in the center of the room, under a broken window, was something I didn't expect, a table. And on that table were several Polaroid photos, spread out like someone had been reviewing them. I stepped closer and my blood ran cold. The photos were of people, different people, all standing in front of that same rusted pole I'd seen in the clearing. Some looked confused, others scared. But what chilled me the most was that in every photo the person was looking straight into the camera, as if they knew they were being watched. I flipped through them, hands shaking. Then I found it. Dean. He was in one of the photos, standing in front of the pole, staring right at the lens. His face was blank, unreadable. I stared at the picture, trying to make sense of it. How had these photos ended up here? And who took them? That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. There was no one there. The door was still ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. I grabbed the photo of Dean and bolted out of the cabin, sprinting back the way I came. But as I ran, I noticed something terrifying. The metal poles had shifted. They weren't in the same spots I'd passed earlier. It was as if the woods themselves were changing, trying to keep me there. By the time I made it back to the main trail, the sun was setting. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My hands were trembling as I started the engine, the photo of Dean still clenched in my fist. I didn't tell Karen about the cabin or the poles, I couldn't. I just gave her the photo and told her the truth. I didn't know where Dean was. She thanked me, but I could tell she knew it was over. The police wouldn't reopen the case, and I had no more answers. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that those poles were part of something bigger, something hidden in those woods. Every so often I think about going back, trying to find the cabin again. But then I remember the footsteps, the shifting poles, and I wonder if I'd ever make it out a second time. Some trails are better left untraveled. The lake thing. I've lived in Washington State my whole life. Growing up around Everett, you get used to the rain, the fog, and the woods. It's just part of the scenery, something you don't even think about after a while. But what happened at Summit Lake last weekend, I'll never forget. My name's Ethan Hayes, and I work as a wildlife biologist for the state. Mostly, I monitor the health of local ecosystems, check up on endangered species, and make sure the environment's doing okay. It's not the most glamorous job, but I love it. Getting out into nature, away from people, and just listening to the wilderness. The world makes sense out there. But last Saturday, nothing made sense. The call came in around noon. A couple of hikers reported a dead animal near the shore of Summit Lake, just outside of Everett. They didn't know what it was, but they said it was big. Too big to be a normal deer or anything like that. Since it was close to my area, I was sent to investigate. Summit Lake's a pretty isolated spot, surrounded by dense forest, and not many people go there unless they're looking for a quiet fishing spot or a hiking trail. When I got to the lake, it was already raining, the sky a thick blanket of gray. Typical for Washington, but it made everything feel heavier, like the air was weighed down with something more than just moisture. I parked my truck by the lake and grabbed my gear. As I made my way to the shore, I could see the hikers' tracks in the mud, leading right to the water's edge. There, half submerged in the shallow water, was the carcass. The thing was massive. At first I thought it might be a bear, but as I got closer I realized it wasn't like anything I'd seen before. The body was bloated, the skin pale and slick with mud, and parts of it were badly decomposed. But there were no visible wounds, no signs of what might have killed it. I knelt down, carefully inspecting it. The head was misshapen, elongated, almost like it had once been some kind of aquatic animal, but nothing that made sense for this area. The limbs were wrong too long, too thin. The closest thing I could think of was a seal, but this thing was at least twice the size of any seal I'd ever encountered, and we were miles from the ocean. As I looked closer, I noticed something else, something disturbing. The creature's eyes were still open, wide and glassy, but they weren't the eyes of a dead animal. They were human. I stumbled back, my heart racing. There was no way that was possible. No animal has human eyes. But there they were, staring up at me through the rain, empty and lifeless. I radioed the office, told them what I found, and they said they'd send someone out to help me collect samples and investigate further. But that was going to take a few hours, and the rain wasn't letting up. I had to document the body before it decomposed any further. As I was setting up my camera, I noticed the water around the body start to ripple. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but the ripples were too deliberate, too focused. Something was moving beneath the surface. I stepped back, scanning the lake. The water was dark, nearly black, with fog hanging low over the surface. For a moment, everything was still, and I wondered if I'd imagined the movement. But then I saw it, something long and dark, just beneath the water, gliding silently toward the shore. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it was massive, easily the size of a small boat, maybe larger, and it was moving straight toward the carcass. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there staring at the water as the thing approached. Just before it reached the body, it disappeared beneath the surface, the ripples vanishing as if it had never been there. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the sound of rain hitting the lake. Then the carcass shifted. It was slow at first, just a slight movement, like something was tugging at it from below. Then, with a sudden violent jerk, the entire body was yanked into the water, disappearing beneath the surface with a splash. I stood there, stunned, the camera still in my hand. Whatever was in that lake had just taken a body bigger than any animal I'd ever seen, and it had done it without making a sound. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I grabbed my gear and ran back to the truck, my mind racing with possibilities. Could it have been a whale? No, that didn't make sense. Summit Lake was too small for anything like that, and we were too far from the ocean. Maybe it was some kind of mutant fish, a giant eel. But those eyes, those human eyes. I radioed the office again, told them what happened, but they didn't seem to take me seriously. They said they'd send someone out tomorrow, but they couldn't get anyone there in time that day. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing moving through the water, silent and slow, pulling the body down into the depths. The next day, I went back to the lake. I didn't want to, but I had to know if the body was still there. When I arrived, the sky was clear and the lake was calm. It looked like nothing had ever happened. I walked down to the shore, half expecting to see the carcass floating there, but the water was empty. There was no sign of the body, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But then I saw it, footprints, leading from the water up to the trees. They weren't human footprints, though. They were long, thin, with webbed toes, like the tracks of some massive amphibian. They were fresh, too, fresh enough that I knew whatever had left them had been here recently. And they weren't just heading into the trees, they were coming out of the lake. I followed the tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. They led deeper into the woods, disappearing into the undergrowth. But there was something else, something even more unsettling. The tracks weren't alone. There were human footprints, too. Bare, muddy feet, walking side by side with whatever had come out of that lake. I stopped. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Could it be that someone had been with the creature? Was it possible that the body I'd seen wasn't just some animal, but something more? I didn't stick around to find out. I turned and headed back to my truck, determined to leave Summit Lake behind for good. I never told anyone about the footprints, not officially. The other biologists who went out the next day said they found nothing unusual. No body, no tracks, nothing. Just a quiet lake and a calm forest. But I know what I saw. Something's living in that lake. Something that doesn't belong there. And it's not just an animal. It's something else. Something that walks between the water and the land. Something that watches from the depths. Whatever it is, it's still out there waiting. The letter. Dear Sam, I hope this letter reaches you before the cops show up at your door asking questions. If they haven't already, they will soon, and I need you to hear the truth from me first. You know I'm not one for writing long letters, but this isn't something I can explain over the phone. I need you to understand everything. It started last week, though looking back, maybe it's been going on longer than that, and I just didn't notice. You remember my dad's accident, right? When I told you he passed? I didn't give you all the details because I wasn't ready to face them myself. It wasn't just a car crash. Dad had been acting strange in the months leading up to it. Quiet, more withdrawn than usual. You know how he used to talk about how some people can sense things, like he had some psychic ability he always hinted at but never explained? I always thought it was just one of his quirks. But toward the end, he was different. He'd stay up late, pacing around the house, staring out the windows, muttering to himself. The night before the accident, he called me and his voice was off. He didn't sound like himself. He said, "It's almost here, Michael. I can feel it, and it's coming for you too." I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought he'd been drinking or maybe just dealing with some old man paranoia. The next morning, he was dead. Crashed his car into a tree at full speed. The police ruled it an accident, said maybe he fell asleep at the wheel, but I know that's not what happened. Not anymore. You'll think I'm crazy when I tell you this, but I need you to hear me out. After the funeral, I started having dreams. At first, they were nothing special, just normal stress dreams, or so I thought. But soon they became more vivid. I'd see Dad standing at the foot of my bed just watching. He wouldn't say anything, just stand there staring at me with those blank eyes. I could smell the faint scent of cigarettes, like the ones he used to smoke, and the air would turn freezing cold. I brushed it off as grief messing with my mind. You'd probably say the same thing and I wouldn't blame you. But then the voice started. It wasn't Dad's voice, Sam. It was something else, something deeper, darker. I'd hear it in the dead of night, right after waking up from one of those dreams. It wasn't outside my window or in the hallway. It was in my head. It whispered things I didn't want to hear, things I still don't fully understand. The worst part was when it said, "You're next." I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just stress, a natural reaction to losing my dad, but last night changed everything. I was at home going through some of Dad's old things. I came across a box tucked away in the back of his closet, stuff I hadn't seen before. Old letters, photos, and this weird stack of cassette tapes. The tapes were marked with dates going back 30 years. I'm not sure what possessed me to do it, but I grabbed the one marked April 12th, 1994, popped it into Dad's old tape recorder, and hit play. I expected some music or maybe a recording of him talking about his theories on life or psychic phenomena. But what I heard was so much worse. It was a conversation, but only one side of it, Dad's. His voice was quiet, almost afraid. He was talking to something that wasn't there, saying things like, "I know you're close. I won't let you have him." And then, in the middle of the tape, he stopped speaking altogether. For a long time, there was just silence. I was about to turn it off when
Michael,
suddenly,
they're coming for you.
His voice came back.
Don't let them in.
But it wasn't
No
just
matter
his
what.
voice anymore.
Don't let them in.
There was something else behind it, like an echo or another presence that I couldn't explain. He said,
"Michael, they're coming for you. Don't let them in, no matter what. Don't let them in."
I shut the tape off right then, shaking. It didn't make any sense. Why would my dad leave something like that behind? And why was he talking about me? I didn't sleep that night. How could I? This morning I heard the voice again, louder this time, clearer. It told me to go to the cemetery. It told me to dig. I don't know why I listened, but I couldn't resist. It was like something was pulling me there. I grabbed a shovel and drove out to Dad's grave. The air was heavy and everything around me felt wrong. I can't explain it. When I got there, I stood over his headstone feeling like an idiot, holding that shovel. But the voice wouldn't stop. It kept whispering, "Dig. You have to see." So I dug. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe just dirt and bones. But as I got deeper, I hit something hard. I cleared away the soil and found a small rusted metal box, locked tight. My hands were shaking as I pried it open. Inside were more tapes, more notes, and a journal. Sam. It's like my dad knew this would happen. He'd been tracking something that's been following our family for years. He wrote about strange things happening to him, dreams he couldn't explain and a presence he couldn't escape. But here's the part that will sound insane. Dad wasn't the first. His father wrote about the same thing, and his father before him. It's like we've been marked for generations. The last entry in the journal was dated the day before he died. It said, "I can't outrun it. I won't let it take him. I'll stop it before it gets to Michael." I haven't even begun to process what this means. But I know one thing. Dad didn't crash his car by accident. He was trying to stop whatever's coming for me. And I think he failed. Here's where things get even weirder, Sam. After I read the journal, I found something else in the box. It was an envelope, addressed to you. I'm not joking, my dad wrote a letter to you years before I ever introduced you to him. And what's even stranger, it's dated 3 weeks from now. How did he know you? How could he know you would be in my life? I haven't opened the letter. It doesn't feel right. I'm sending it along with this one. I don't know what it says, but it feels like a warning. Whatever this is, Sam, it's bigger than just me. I think you're a part of it too. And I think my dad knew that long before we ever met. I'm leaving town tonight. I don't know where I'm going yet, but I can't stay here. Not with this thing haunting me. If I don't make it, you'll know why. Take care of yourself, Sam. And don't open that letter unless you have to. Michael. Beneath the Surface, Secrets of Seattle's Underground. My name is Mark Reynolds, and until last month I was a city maintenance worker in Seattle. I've lived here my whole life, navigating the rain-soaked streets and watching the skyline evolve. But beneath the surface of this modern city lies a forgotten world, one that most people never think about. The Seattle Underground, a network of abandoned subterranean passages and basements that once formed the city's ground level before it was rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1889. My job often took me into these tunnels to inspect old utilities and ensure that nothing down there posed a risk to the bustling city above. It was routine work, and I'd grown accustomed to the eerie silence and stale air. But on a chilly Tuesday morning, something happened that I can't explain, and it has changed everything I thought I knew about this city. I was assigned to investigate a series of power fluctuations detected in the Pioneer Square area. The electrical grid had been experiencing brief outages, and the source seemed to be somewhere underground. Armed with a flashlight, a map, and my tool belt, I descended into the depths via a rarely used access point behind an old bookstore. The tunnels were, as I remembered, a labyrinth of brick walls, iron beams, and the remnants of a bygone era. My map showed the main corridors and utility lines, but as I traced the cables, I noticed something odd. A conduit split off from the main line, heading into an area that wasn't marked. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed the uncharted path, ducking under low-hanging pipes and stepping over debris. The air grew colder, and the walls began to change, from brick to an older, rough-hewn stone. After what felt like half a mile, I arrived at a large circular chamber I had never seen before. In the center stood a massive, archaic machine made of brass and steel, covered in gears, levers, and dials. It looked like something out of a Jules Verne novel. The machine hummed softly, emitting a faint glow from small glass tubes embedded within its structure. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. This wasn't city infrastructure. There was no record of anything like this existing beneath Seattle. I reached out to touch one of the levers, and as my fingers brushed the cold metal, the machine shuddered to life. The humming grew louder and the glow intensified. Suddenly, the chamber was filled with projections, images flickering like old film reels, showing scenes of Seattle throughout different eras. I saw the Great Fire, the construction of the Space Needle, even events that hadn't happened yet, a futuristic skyline with buildings I didn't recognize. Overwhelmed, I stepped back, but the images began to blur together, and a sharp pain shot through my head. I collapsed to the ground, the world spinning around me. Before everything went dark, I heard a whisper. It must remain hidden. I woke up in the same chamber, but the machine was silent and the projections were gone. Dazed, I checked my watch. I'd been unconscious for over an hour. I needed to get out of there. As I made my way back, the tunnels seemed different. Passages that were once clear were now blocked and new paths had opened up. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. My radio crackled, but all I could hear was static. After wandering for what felt like hours, I stumbled upon another chamber. This one was smaller, with walls covered in strange symbols and writings in languages I didn't recognize. In the center was a pedestal holding an old book bound in worn leather. Against my better judgment, I opened the book. The pages were filled with diagrams of the machine I'd seen and notes about temporal stabilization and controlling the flow of time. One entry stood out. The device must be protected at all costs. If misused, it could unravel the fabric of reality. Only the Guardians shall know its secrets. A cold dread washed over me. Had I activated something I shouldn't have? Were the visions I saw glimpses of alternate timelines? Determined to set things right, I retraced my steps to the chamber with the machine. This time I was met by a group of figures dressed in dark cloaks, their faces obscured. One stepped forward and spoke in a stern voice. "You were not meant to find this place." "I didn't mean any harm," I stammered. "I was just doing my job." "Your actions have consequences," he said. "The machine is not a toy for the curious. It maintains the balance." "I think I activated it by accident," I admitted. "How do I fix it?" The figures exchanged glances. "You cannot, but perhaps you can help us." They explained that they were part of an ancient order tasked with guarding the machine, which was built by a forgotten civilization to monitor and preserve the continuity of time. My interference had disrupted its function, creating anomalies in the timeline. "Anomalies?" I asked. "Events that should not happen. Disruptions in reality," the leader replied. They needed someone from outside their order to recalibrate the machine, someone who had already interacted with it. Reluctantly, I agreed. Under their guidance, I adjusted the levers and dials, following intricate instructions. As I worked, the machine began to stabilize, its humming turning into a steady rhythm. "That should do it," I said, stepping back. "Thank you," the leader said. "But you must understand. You can never speak of this." Before I could respond, one of the figures touched my forehead, and everything went black. I woke up in my bed, sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But when I checked my phone, I saw that 3 days had passed. Returning to work, I tried to find records of my assignment, but there was nothing. My supervisor said I'd been on leave. Confused, I visited the access point behind the bookstore, but it was sealed off, covered in graffiti that looked years old. I began to question my sanity until I found the book, the one from the chamber, on my nightstand. Its pages were blank, except for one line. "The balance is restored, remember your promise." Since then, strange things have happened. People I know recall events differently, and places around the city seem changed. I overhear conversations about incidents that I have no memory of, and landmarks appear altered. I don't know what to make of it all. Maybe the machine couldn't fully fix the disruptions. Or perhaps, by involving me, the Guardians set in motion changes they couldn't foresee. I'm sharing this story not to convince anyone, but to unburden myself. If you're ever exploring the hidden corners of this city or any city, be cautious. Some secrets are guarded for a reason, and sometimes the past is better left buried. I no longer work for the city. I've moved to a small town far from Seattle, hoping to find peace. But every so often I catch glimpses, out of the corner of my eye, of flickering images and hear the faint hum of machinery. And I wonder if the balance was truly restored, or if my actions set something irreversible in motion. The house on Briar Rd. I didn't believe in evil places until I set foot in the house on Briar Rd. Even now, as I sit here trying to make sense of what happened, I can still smell the damp rot in the air, feel the cold grip of that place closing around me. It's like it's never really left me. It started with a phone call. A new case had come across my desk, unusual but not totally out of the realm of reason. A house in the small town of Elmsworth had recently gone up for sale, and prospective buyers had begun reporting strange occurrences. Lights turning on by themselves, windows rattling with no wind, and more disturbingly, a strange humming sound coming from the basement. It was classic haunted house stuff, but what caught my attention was the fact that it wasn't just one or two buyers. It was everyone who stepped inside, and none of them lasted more than an hour in the house before bolting for the door. I thought it was a simple case of urban legend, a town trying to sell a spooky tale along with its real estate. But I couldn't ignore the number of reports. The realtor had refused to enter the house after the second tour, and by the fourth incident, local police had gotten involved. The final straw came when a couple who toured the house reported seeing something they refused to describe, moving through the dark hallways. They left town that same night and never came back. By the time I arrived in Elmsworth, the town was buzzing with rumors. The house on Briar Rd had been there for generations, passed down through one family for over a century. But after the last family died off in a car accident 10 years ago, it had sat abandoned. No one had set foot in it until the recent attempt to sell, and no one seemed to know much about the family that had once lived there. The locals only whispered about the house, as though speaking of it too loudly might wake it up. I arrived at the house just before sunset. From the outside, it looked like any other rundown Victorian-style home. Peeling paint, cracked windows, the lawn overgrown and wild. But there was something else, something harder to define. It felt wrong, as if the house itself was alive, watching me as I walked toward the front door. The realtor had left the key under the mat, too afraid to meet me in person. I couldn't blame her. Even standing on the porch, I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air inside was stale, damp with the smell of decay. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners like curtains. I took a deep breath and switched on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a long hallway with faded wallpaper and creaky wooden floors. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard the faint sound of humming. I explored the house room by room, trying to get a sense of what had everyone so spooked. The upstairs bedrooms were empty, the furniture long since removed, but there was an undeniable sense of unease in the air, as though I wasn't alone. I shook it off and made my way downstairs, heading toward the basement door at the end of the hallway. The humming grew louder as I approached, a low, almost mechanical sound that sent a shiver down my spine. The door to the basement was heavy, its handle cold to the touch. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, and as I stepped onto the first creaky step, I felt the air change around me. It was colder down there, unnaturally cold. The basement was just as I'd expected, bare, unfinished, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling. But something felt wrong. The humming was louder now, filling the space, but I couldn't see anything that would be making the noise. No appliances, no machinery, just concrete walls and darkness. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, half hidden in the shadows, something moved. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But as I stepped closer, I realized there was something, or someone, lurking there. I aimed my flashlight at the spot, but the beam seemed to flicker, the light weakening as if the darkness itself was swallowing it up. "Hello?" My voice echoed in the empty room, but there was no answer. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, hunched over, its shape barely distinguishable from the shadows. My heart raced as I took another step forward, the floorboards groaning under my weight. Suddenly, the humming stopped, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. And then I heard it. A low, guttural whisper, so quiet I could barely make out the words.
"Get out."
I froze. The voice was coming from the corner, from the figure that still hadn't moved. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted to the spot, staring into the darkness as the whisper grew louder, more insistent.
"Get out. Now."
I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I grabbed my flashlight and made for the front door, but just as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut on its own. The house groaned, the walls seeming to close in on me as that horrible whisper echoed through the halls. I ran to the nearest window, but it wouldn't budge. The whole house felt alive now, trapping me inside, determined to keep me there. The floor beneath me vibrated, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if something was moving through them, something I couldn't see.
Get out!
The whisper came again, louder this time, closer. I didn't wait to hear it again. I grabbed a chair and smashed it through the nearest window, jumping through the shattered glass and landing hard on the overgrown lawn. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I was back in my car, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. As I sped away, I looked back at the house. It stood there, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something was inside that house, something that didn't want anyone to leave. I drove straight to the police station and filed my report, but I could see the doubt in the officer's eyes. No one would believe me. They'd write it off as stress, as overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that the house on Briar Rd is waiting for its next visitor. The hunger. I've always had a pretty normal life. Job as a clerk at a small convenience store, a small apartment in the quieter part of town, and not much else to my name. I wasn't complaining. Life was fine, quiet, simple, easy. But lately, something's changed. It started about 2 months ago. I was working the night shift like I usually do when I felt it for the first time. A deep, gnawing hunger. Not the kind you feel when you miss a meal. It was worse than that. It felt like something inside me was empty, something I needed to fill. No matter how much I ate, nothing helped. I'd go through bags of chips, candy, entire meals, but the hunger stayed. It only got worse. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would I even tell? It seemed crazy, like I was losing my mind. I tried to ignore it, convinced myself it was just stress or a bad stomach bug. But then came the dreams. In the dreams I was hunting. It's hard to explain, but I could feel this raw, primal need driving me forward. I'd be running through dark streets, my vision blurry, like I was chasing something. I never knew what I was chasing, but I could feel its pulse, its life force. And I needed it. The hunger, the same one that followed me while I was awake, was unbearable in my sleep. The worst part? I started waking up in strange places. At first, it was harmless enough. I'd wake up on the couch instead of in my bed, or find myself standing at the window in the middle of the night, staring into the darkness. But then, one morning, I woke up outside. My clothes were dirty, my shoes caked in mud. I had no memory of leaving the apartment. No idea how I got there. The hunger was worse that morning. It was like something was clawing at my insides, demanding more. I couldn't focus at work. My hands shook, and every customer that walked in made me uneasy. Not because I was scared of them, because I was drawn to them. I could hear their heartbeats, feel the warmth of their bodies as they passed by. I had to clench my fists to stop myself from staring at them too long. Then it happened. It was late, nearly closing time. A man came in, just a regular guy looking to grab a drink and some snacks before heading home. He smiled as he approached the counter, but I barely heard him. All I could hear was the thudding of his heart, steady and strong. All I could feel was the hunger, roaring inside me, demanding to be fed. I tried to focus on the transaction, tried to keep my cool, but my vision blurred. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and my hands trembled as I rang up his purchase. The hunger was overwhelming now, gnawing at me, clouding my mind. "Are you okay, man?" the customer asked, his voice pulling me out of my daze. I blinked, realizing how close I'd been to losing control. I forced a smile, my heart racing. "Yeah, sorry, just tired." But it was more than that. I could feel the hunger creeping up, trying to take over. I handed him his change, my hand shaking slightly, but I managed to keep it together. He gave me a concerned look, thanked me, and left the store. As soon as he walked out the door, I collapsed behind the counter, gasping for breath. I'd come so close to doing something I didn't even want to think about. My body trembled, my stomach twisted with guilt and fear. I hadn't hurt him, but it was a close call. I knew something was seriously wrong with me. I didn't sleep that night, I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that moment at the counter, the way the hunger had almost taken control. I had never felt anything like it before, and the thought of what could have happened terrified me. But as much as I hated myself for what I had nearly done, I couldn't deny it. The hunger had faded, if only for a little while. The next day, it came back, worse than ever. The dreams returned, more vivid, more violent. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, the hunger gnawing at me, stronger than before. I knew I needed to find answers. I tried going to the doctor, but what could I say? That I felt an uncontrollable hunger, something deeper than food? That I had this urge to be around people, but not in a normal way? I ended up giving a weak explanation, something about stress and insomnia. They ran a few tests, said nothing was physically wrong with me, and sent me home. I tried everything: meditation, more food, distracting myself with work. But nothing helped. Every night the dreams would come, and every day I would feel that same emptiness gnawing at me. I was scared to go back to work, scared I'd lose control again. But I didn't have much of a choice. I needed the job, and no one else could cover my shifts. So I went back, telling myself that I'd stay calm, that I'd avoid letting the hunger take over. For a while I managed. I kept my distance from customers, avoided eye contact, and focused on staying busy. But the hunger never really went away. It was always there, just below the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness. I don't know how much longer I can keep it at bay. People are starting to notice. My boss, my co-workers, even the regular customers. They ask if I'm okay, if I'm eating enough. I just smile and say I'm fine, but inside I know the truth. Whatever this is, it's not going away. I don't know what's happening to me, but I know one thing. The hunger is getting stronger. And I'm not sure how long I can keep fighting it. Faded hours. I've always heard stories about strange inheritances, unclaimed riches, lost family fortunes, cursed objects, but I never thought I'd be part of one. My life was quiet, dull even, before I received the letter. A lawyer, some obscure firm I'd never heard of, contacted me to say I was the sole inheritor of an old house in a small town a few hours away. No explanation, no family tree, just a set of keys and an address. The house was just as unremarkable as the town. Old, a little weathered, but not falling apart. 2 stories, creaky floors, and ivy crawling up the sides like it had grown tired of holding the place together. I spent the first few days cleaning, sorting through dusty furniture and piles of forgotten things. It was odd. The house felt untouched, as if no one had lived there for years, and yet there wasn't a single cobweb or sign of decay. It wasn't eerie, not at first, just sterile. On the 4th day, I stumbled upon the room. It was strange because, according to the blueprints I found stuffed in the attic, this room shouldn't exist. I had combed through the entire house, mentally matching every room with the floor plan. But this room, tucked behind a narrow corridor in the back of the house, wasn't marked anywhere. Not on the plans, not on any documentation. Yet there it was, a hollow, windowless room, devoid of any decoration or furniture. Just 4 walls, a ceiling, and a floor, all painted in an off-putting pale gray. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the room was added later, after the original plans were drawn. Maybe it was a storage room, or a panic room of sorts. But the more I stood there, the more wrong it felt. The room was too empty, in a way I can't explain. It wasn't just physically bare. It felt like it was missing something intangible, like sound. The air inside the room was thicker, almost suffocating, but that's not what disturbed me most. It was the way time behaved in there. The first time I stepped inside, it felt like hours had passed. My phone died quickly, no signal of course, and when I finally left the room thinking I'd been in there for half the day, I checked the clock. Only 5 minutes had gone by. I tried again, setting a timer this time. I stepped inside, closed the door, and counted. When I came out, the timer showed 1 minute had passed, but I knew deep in my bones that I had spent much longer than that inside. Curiosity got the best of me. Over the next few days, I tested the room obsessively. I brought in books, notebooks, a stopwatch, anything I could think of to try and track the distortion. No matter what I did, the result was always the same. Time outside the room moved faster. Minutes felt like days inside. At first, I thought I had stumbled upon something incredible, a way to cheat time itself. But the more I stayed in the room, the harder it became to leave. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. I would go inside to read or write or just think, and when I left, I'd feel off, drained. The first few times, I chalked it up to exhaustion from work, from cleaning the house, from the stress of adjusting to this new, bizarre situation. But it didn't stop. Every time I left the room, it was harder to focus, harder to keep track of my thoughts. My body felt heavy, like gravity had a tighter grip on me outside the room than it did inside. One day, after what felt like only a few hours in the room, I stepped out to find that 2 full days had passed. 2 days. My phone was flooded with missed calls and messages from work. The fridge was empty because I hadn't been to the store. My reflection in the bathroom mirror startled me. My skin looked paler, thinner, as if it had lost its elasticity. My eyes were sunken, my hair thinner at the temples. I didn't understand what was happening. Was I sick? Was the room making me sick? I decided to stop using it. I shut the door, locked it even, and tried to go back to normal. But the house, hell, the world, felt wrong without it. Time outside the room dragged on, days feeling longer than the years I had spent before I moved in. I'd wake up in the middle of the night sweating, thinking about the room. I started hearing it. Not noises exactly, but a feeling, a subtle pull, like the room wanted me back inside. After 2 weeks, I gave in. It was worse this time. The room had grown, or at least it felt like it. The walls were further apart, the ceiling higher, the air thinner. I sat down in the center of the room and stayed. I didn't bring a timer. I didn't bring anything. I just sat there waiting for something, though I didn't know what. Hours, days, maybe weeks passed inside, but I didn't move. I didn't want to move. The room was consuming me, and I let it. When I finally left, the world had changed. Months had passed. Months I couldn't remember. My phone was dead. My emails filled with angry messages from people wondering where I had disappeared to. My body was frail, my muscles weak, as though I hadn't used them in years. I looked at myself in the mirror again, and this time, I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. The worst part was I didn't care. The room had taken something from me, something essential. My will to live outside it. It wasn't just that time passed differently inside. The room was feeding on me. The longer I stayed in there, the more it siphoned away my sense of reality, my sense of self. I didn't want to leave anymore because the room was becoming me. Or maybe I was becoming the room. I tried to resist it once more. Just once. One last time. I locked the door, this time with heavy chains. I moved the furniture to block the entrance. But the room called to me. I could hear it whispering, not through sound, but through a sensation. My body ached without it. The world outside had become an unbearable place to exist. I've been inside for a long time now. Days, weeks, years. It doesn't matter. The room is everything. It's where I exist. And everything outside is fading away, like a distant memory. I can feel it now. The room's hunger. It feeds on me, but I can't stop. I won't stop. The room isn't just a place. It's alive. It grows stronger with every second I spend here, and soon, I think it will no longer need me. Maybe it never did. the Vanishing Reflection. I'd always been a man of routines. Every morning I'd wake up at 6, brush my teeth, and look in the mirror. It sounds mundane, but there was something calming about seeing myself each day. The familiar face, the routine grin, the same tired eyes. It made me feel anchored, like the world couldn't throw me off kilter. That all changed on the morning of January 12th, when I looked in the mirror and saw nothing. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe the bulbs had dimmed, or the bathroom fog was playing tricks on me. I wiped the glass with my hand and squinted. Still nothing, just an empty reflection staring back at me. I blinked, leaning in closer, my face hovering mere inches from the glass. Nothing. My reflection had vanished, leaving the room behind me perfectly visible. The towel draped over the hook, the plant in the corner, the half-used bottle of shampoo on the shelf. They were all there. But me? I was gone. I jerked away from the mirror, heart pounding in my chest. Maybe I was still dreaming? A quick pinch on my arm assured me otherwise. Fully awake, I rushed to the living room and grabbed my phone, turning on the front-facing camera. The result was the same. No reflection, just the background of my cluttered apartment. It felt as though I had evaporated from existence. I tried calling out sick from work, but the moment my boss heard my voice, he reminded me I had a client meeting. "Just show up and wing it," he said. I hung up, hands trembling. Wing it? How was I supposed to meet with clients when I couldn't even see myself in a mirror? Still, I put on a suit, though I couldn't fix my tie. There was no reflection to help me adjust it. The absurdity of it all made me laugh. A dry, bitter laugh that died as quickly as it came. On my way to work, I caught glimpses of shop windows, car mirrors, and the shiny surface of a puddle. But nothing. No sign of me anywhere. My stomach churned, a deep sense of unease growing. I wanted to tell someone, ask if they could see me. But how do you explain something so bizarre without sounding like a madman? The office felt even more surreal. Colleagues walked past, chatting, oblivious. I found myself questioning reality. Was I still here? I felt the weight of my footsteps, the coolness of the air conditioner, but it all seemed muted, distant. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I slipped away to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I stood before the mirror. Still no reflection. I punched the wall, hoping the pain would somehow shake me back into reality. It didn't. Instead, the bathroom lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Then I saw it. Not my reflection, but a faint shape, a silhouette, shifting just beneath the surface of the mirror. It was human-like, but wrong. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, its limbs too long, too thin. And its eyes, dark, hollow pits that seemed to stare straight through me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The silhouette moved closer to the glass, pressing its face against the surface as if trying to push through. My breath caught in my throat. Was it trying to replace me? I bolted out of the bathroom, hands clammy, my thoughts racing. I needed answers. Was this some sort of hallucination? A stress-induced breakdown? Or was something far more sinister at play? I went home early, hoping to escape whatever nightmare had gripped me. That night, I avoided mirrors like the plague, terrified that the figure might return. But curiosity got the better of me. Around midnight, I grabbed a hand mirror from my bedside table and held it up in the dim glow of my bedroom lamp. There it was again, the same silhouette, now clearer. Its head tilted, and for a second I swore it smiled. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I hurled the mirror across the room, the glass shattering into 1,000 tiny shards. Sleep was impossible after that. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind made me jump. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped in a body that was somehow no longer mine. The next morning I called in sick for real. My voice was shaky, and I'm sure my boss thought I was hungover. But the truth was far worse. The figure in the mirror had become more persistent, more defined. It watched me, waiting, its presence looming like a dark cloud over everything I did. Over the next few days, I became obsessed. I covered every mirror in my apartment with cloth, avoided my reflection at all costs. But no matter what I did, I could feel it. An invisible tether pulling me towards the mirrors, daring me to look, daring me to see what waited on the other side. On the 5th day, I gave in. I uncovered the largest mirror in my bedroom and stood before it. The silhouette was waiting, grinning. It raised a hand and I, without thinking, mirrored the motion. My hand touched the cold glass, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then I felt it. A sharp tug, like something pulling at the core of my being. I tried to pull away, but my hand was stuck. The mirror began to ripple, as if it were made of liquid. The figure on the other side pressed harder, and I felt myself being dragged forward, my reflectionless form merging with the dark silhouette. Panic surged through me, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure grinned wider, its hollow eyes gleaming with something ancient and malevolent. I felt my consciousness slip, drowning in the cold depths of the mirror. When I awoke, I was no longer in my apartment. The world around me was warped, twisted, an endless expanse of reflective surfaces, all showing the same thing. The silhouette, now perfectly still, standing in my place. I banged on the glass, screamed for help, but it was useless. The figure smiled back at me from my own world, living my life, wearing my skin. And me? I was trapped, forever behind the glass, watching from the other side. The tunnels beneath us. It wasn't uncommon to hear strange noises in the old apartment building where I lived. The walls were thin, and the pipes groaned whenever someone used water. Over time, you got used to it. The hum of the heating system, the occasional thud from the floor above, the faint creaking as the building settled into its old bones. But about a month ago, something changed. The sounds shifted. They became rhythmic. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A distant tapping, almost like a knock, every night around 2 a.m., always from beneath my floor. I assumed it was some maintenance work, though it was strange that the noise would be so regular, always at the same time, and always beneath me. Our building had no basement. I knew this for a fact because I'd explored the place when I first moved in. It was just an old 4-story structure, tucked away in a forgotten part of the city, with narrow hallways and stained carpets that had seen better days. Still, the rent was cheap, and the location was central. It was the kind of building where people didn't ask too many questions. But the noise started to get under my skin. It was a soft but deliberate tapping, like someone knocking on a wooden door over and over again. I wasn't the only one who heard it. My downstairs neighbor, Miriam, complained about it one morning. We ran into each other at the mailboxes, her eyes red with sleeplessness. "Do you hear that sound every night?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if she was afraid someone would overhear. "Yeah," I nodded. "What do you think it is? Pipes?" Miriam shook her head, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with her keys. "I don't know, but it's coming from below my floor too, and we're on the ground floor. There's nothing beneath us." I froze, my stomach twisting. Miriam lived directly beneath me, and if she was hearing the same tapping, coming from below her apartment, then something wasn't right. How could there be anything beneath the ground floor? We brushed it off that day, but the idea lingered in my mind. The next night, the tapping started again at precisely 2 a.m., as it had for weeks. But this time, it was louder. I pressed my ear to the floor, my heart racing as I strained to hear. The tapping was steady, almost like Morse code, though I didn't understand the pattern. It sounded close. Curiosity gnawed at me. I couldn't sleep with the sound continuing every night, so I did something I hadn't thought to do before. I went outside. The building had a small courtyard surrounded by brick walls, and the back alley led to a rusted metal door that no one ever used. I slipped through the side exit and stood in the alley, staring at the base of the building, my breath clouding in the cold night air. I scanned the foundation, half expecting to find some logical explanation. Maybe a broken vent or an old access panel. But there was nothing. Just the cold stone of the building's foundation stretching into the shadows. Except there. I almost missed it at first. Hidden behind an overgrown cluster of bushes and piles of forgotten junk was a small, rusted hatch, bolted into the ground. I crouched down, brushing away the dirt and debris. The hatch was old, the metal worn thin and covered in patches of rust. My fingers traced the outline of a circular lock that had long since been broken. Whoever had installed this hatch had abandoned it a long time ago. My mind raced. Could this be the source of the noise? But how could anyone be down there? I hesitated for a long moment, but the tapping, now louder than ever, echoed in my ears. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Slowly, I gripped the handle of the hatch and pulled. It groaned in protest, but eventually gave way with a metallic screech. Below the hatch was a dark, narrow shaft leading into the earth. A ladder, corroded with age, descended into the blackness. A foul, damp odor rose from the opening, making my stomach churn. Every instinct screamed at me to shut the hatch and forget this place existed, but I couldn't. Something was drawing me down there. I grabbed a flashlight from my apartment and returned to the alley, determined to see what was beneath. Climbing down the ladder was harder than I expected. The metal rungs felt brittle, and the darkness below seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. The tapping grew louder as I descended, echoing up the shaft, vibrating through the walls. Finally, I reached the bottom and found myself in a narrow tunnel. The ceiling was low, and the air was thick with moisture. The walls were lined with crumbling bricks, blackened with age, and an old sewage pipe ran along one side. But it wasn't the tunnel itself that terrified me, it was the door. At the end of the tunnel, about 50 feet from where I stood, was a door. A heavy iron door with deep, unnatural grooves cut into the surface, like someone had clawed at it from the inside. The tapping was louder now, rhythmic and insistent, coming from beyond the door. I swallowed the rising panic and approached the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, and for a moment I hesitated. What if whatever was behind this door wasn't supposed to be found? What if it was supposed to stay locked away? But the tapping continued, and I couldn't turn back now. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with strange objects. Old jars, brittle books, rusted tools. At the center of the room was a large stone slab, and on it lay a figure. My heart stopped. The figure was human-shaped, but wrong. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were wide open, staring straight up at the ceiling, as if frozen in terror. Its mouth moved slowly, making the same rhythmic tapping sound I had heard every night. It wasn't knocking. It was its teeth, chattering in a steady, mechanical rhythm. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The figure didn't move. It didn't acknowledge me. It just lay there, tapping, tapping, tapping. I turned to run, but as I did, I noticed something even more horrifying. Along the walls of the chamber, beneath the shelves, were more stone slabs. Dozens of them. And on each slab lay a figure, just like the one in the center of the room, all of them pale, motionless, with their teeth tapping in unison. I fled the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced back down the tunnel, climbing the ladder as fast as I could. The tapping followed me, echoing up the shaft, louder and faster, as if the figures were chasing me with their rhythmic, mechanical chatter. I threw the hatch shut behind me and stumbled back into the alley, gasping for air. The tapping had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me from below. The next morning, I went to tell Miriam what I'd found, but her apartment was empty. No one had seen her. Days passed, and she never returned. I called the police, but they found no sign of her. Her disappearance was just another unsolved mystery in a building full of secrets. That night, the tapping started again, louder this time, closer. I packed my things and left the apartment for good. But no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I still hear it. The sound of teeth tapping in the silence. And I know deep down that one day they'll come for me too. The Dollmaker's Curse. I never believed in curses, not until last week. My name is Nathan Greer, and I'm a carpenter by trade, specializing in custom furniture. I moved to Salem, Massachusetts a few years back, drawn by the town's history and, honestly, its odd charm. Salem has a way of getting under your skin, the witch trials, the legends of ghosts, the ever-present tourist traps. It's a place full of stories, most of them just that, stories. But sometimes stories come to life. It started with a job offer, like any other. I'd gotten a call from a local historian, Martha Danvers, asking me to come by her house to take a look at some old furniture that needed restoring. Martha had inherited a large estate on the outskirts of town, one of those colonial-era mansions that creaked under the weight of its own history. When I arrived, she greeted me with a nervous smile. She was in her 60s, sharp-eyed and always dressed like she'd just stepped out of the 19th century. She led me inside, and the moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it, something heavy in the air. Not quite a smell, more like the weight of the house pressing down on me. Martha showed me to a small room at the back of the house, where a large wooden chest sat beneath a dust-covered sheet. "I need this chest restored," she said, tugging the sheet off and revealing the faded, ornate carvings etched into the wood. "It's been in my family for generations. It was my great-great-grandfather's. He was a toy maker." I nodded, running my hands over the surface of the chest. It was beautifully crafted, though the wood was weathered and the hinges rusted. "I can have this looking new in a few weeks," I said, mentally calculating the work it would take. Martha hesitated, glancing at the chest like she wasn't sure whether she wanted me to open it. "There's something else I should mention," she said slowly. "There's something inside it." She didn't need to tell me twice. I knelt down and unhooked the rusted latch, the old metal groaning in protest. When I lifted the lid, a puff of stale air hit me, along with a faint, sickly sweet smell, like decaying flowers. Inside the chest was a doll. It was old, really old. The porcelain face was cracked, and the eyes, though glassy, seemed to follow me as I moved. The doll was dressed in a faded, frilly dress, its hands resting gently in its lap. There was something unsettling about the way it sat, too perfect, like it had been carefully placed there. The strangest thing, though, was its size. It wasn't a typical doll for a child. It was almost the size of a toddler. Martha shifted uncomfortably. "That doll belonged to my great-great-grandfather. It's said to be cursed." I laughed, though the sound came out more nervous than I intended. "A cursed doll?" Martha didn't laugh. "People say that everyone who owns it, something bad happens to them." I looked down at the doll again, feeling a chill creep up my spine. The eyes stared blankly up at me, but there was something almost knowing about the way they gleamed in the dim light. "I don't believe in curses," I said, trying to shake the feeling. "But I can take the chest, restore it, and bring it back in a few weeks. The doll can stay here, right?" Martha nodded quickly. "Please." I took the chest back to my workshop and got to work. The restoration wasn't difficult, just time-consuming. I sanded down the rough spots, replaced the rusted hinges, and began working on the carvings. But the entire time I couldn't stop thinking about the doll. I tried to brush it off as superstition, but every night after I left Martha's house I had the same dream. I was in the room with the chest and the doll was sitting on the floor, staring up at me. In the dream, I'd try to turn away, but I couldn't. I was frozen, forced to look at it as its cracked porcelain face smiled, the eyes shining with some dark, unnatural light. And every time, right before I woke up, I heard a whisper. "You can't leave." A week into the restoration, I decided to head back to Martha's to give her an update. When I arrived at the house, something was off. The front door was slightly ajar and the place was silent. Too silent. I called her name, but there was no response. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw the trail of dirt and leaves leading down the hall. The door to the back room, where the chest had been, was open. My stomach dropped. The doll was gone. I searched the house, calling out for Martha, but she was nowhere to be found. The air inside the house felt colder, sharper, like it was closing in on me. I made my way to the back room, and that's when I saw it. The doll was sitting on the floor right in front of the chest in the exact same position as I had seen it in my dreams. The eyes stared up at me, and I swear I could hear something, just at the edge of my hearing, like a faint whisper. "Where's Martha?" I muttered to myself, stepping closer. Then, as if in response, the doll moved. It was just a twitch, barely noticeable, but I saw it. One of the hands shifted, the tiny porcelain fingers curling slightly. I stumbled back, my heart racing. This couldn't be happening. Dolls didn't move on their own. It had to be some trick of the light, my mind playing games with me. But then, from behind me, I heard the whisper again, louder this time. "You can't leave!" I ran out of the house, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for air. I didn't care about the chest anymore. I just needed to get away from that place, away from that thing. I drove home, shaking, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. It was just a doll. But when I got back to my apartment, the air felt wrong, heavy. I opened the door to my workshop, and there, sitting on the floor in the center of the room, was the doll. The same doll, the one I had just left behind in Martha's house. I froze, the blood draining from my face. This was impossible. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't brought it here. The doll's head slowly turned, its glass eyes locking onto mine, and in the silence of the room I heard it again, the whisper, clear and sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "You belong to me now." Beneath the frost. I'd never wanted to take the job in Alaska, but when the money is good and your prospects are slim, you don't have much choice. They called it a research expedition, but it felt more like a punishment. We were stationed in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but snow, ice, and the relentless wind. Our task? To drill deep beneath the permafrost and collect samples that could help us understand climate patterns from thousands of years ago. At first, it was just me and 4 other scientists. Dr. Peters, the geologist, Lauren, a climatologist, Jonas, the biologist, and Marcus, a tech specialist. We were all bundled into this small facility, barely more than a cabin outfitted with scientific equipment and basic living quarters. The isolation wasn't the worst part, at least not at first. It was the cold. No matter how many layers you wore or how close you sat to the heater, the chill seeped into your bones. Then, after about a week of drilling, we hit something. We had sent the drill more than 100 feet down through layers of ice when it jammed. No matter how much we coaxed the machine, it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, Dr. Peters decided to send down a camera. What we found didn't make sense. Beneath the ice was something black. Not rock, not more ice. Something that seemed to absorb light, giving off a faint, unnatural shimmer. None of us could figure out what it was, but Jonas insisted it was organic. "It's definitely alive," he muttered, watching the feed from the camera. Or it was. I didn't like the way he said it. Lauren suggested we drill around it, but Peters was fascinated. He wanted to take a sample, said it could be a discovery that would make his career. So we did. That's when things started to go wrong. It was Peters who first began acting strange. We thought it was just exhaustion from long hours, but then he stopped talking altogether. He'd just sit there, staring at the ice, muttering to himself about what lies beneath. His hands shook constantly, and when I caught him one night standing in the lab, he was staring at the sample we'd taken from the black material under the ice. The thing pulsed faintly under the microscope, a rhythm like a slow heartbeat. I didn't dare get too close. A few days later, Marcus found Peters in the drilling room, standing naked in the freezing cold, staring down the borehole. His skin was blue, frost forming on his eyelashes, but he didn't seem to notice. It took all of us to drag him inside, but it was already too late. He was dead by the time we got him back to the heaters. We were all shaken, but we told ourselves it was some kind of mental breakdown brought on by isolation and stress. That's what people did out here, right? They cracked. But it didn't explain the way his body had turned so quickly, or why. Even as we covered him with a blanket, his mouth was still moving like he was trying to speak through frozen lips. Jonas insisted on an autopsy. Lauren and I refused, but he said it was the only way to understand what had happened. We let him have his way, and that's when we discovered the worms. Inside Peter's body, Jonas found small black worms, coiled deep within his tissue. They were thin, barely noticeable, but they were alive, barely writhing as Jonas picked them out one by one. He was fascinated. The rest of us were horrified. "They must have been in the sample," Jonas said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "Parasites, trapped in the ice for millennia." I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't get out of my mind the way Peters had been staring at the drill site, as if something down there was calling to him, something that had been disturbed. The next morning, Lauren found Jonas outside the facility. He had wandered off in the middle of the night, dressed only in his thermals, leaving the doors wide open. His footprints led straight to the drill site, but he was nowhere to be found. The wind had already erased any trace of him. That left just Lauren, Marcus, and me. We sealed off the lab, barricading the doors and cutting off any access to the samples. None of us wanted to touch whatever had killed Peters, or Jonas. But something had already gotten inside us. Marcus started complaining of headaches and itching under his skin. I didn't want to admit it, but I was feeling it too. A crawling sensation, like something was just beneath the surface, wriggling through my veins. By that night, Marcus had locked himself in the tech room, refusing to come out. Lauren and I tried to get him to let us in, but he screamed at us to stay away. I don't know how long it was before the screaming stopped. Lauren wanted to get out, but we were trapped. A storm had rolled in, burying the facility under feet of snow, and the radio was dead. We couldn't call for help. The days blurred together after that. Neither of us slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the worms, feel them burrowing deeper. It was Lauren who finally cracked. She came into the common room with a knife, her eyes wide, her face pale. "It's inside us," she whispered, raising the blade to her arm. "We have to get it out." I tried to stop her, but before I could move, she drove the knife into her forearm, cutting deep. Blood spilled onto the floor, but there, in the midst of it, I saw something else. Something black, squirming, wriggling just beneath her skin. The worms. She screamed, dropping the knife, and I dragged her into the medbay, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. By morning, she was dead. I'm alone now. The storm has finally passed, but the radio is still dead. I know it won't be long before I end up like the others. I can feel it. The worms crawling through my body, taking control, whispering to me in a language I can't understand. I've sealed myself in the lab, away from the rest of the facility. I don't know how much longer I have before it takes me to, but I'm writing this down in case someone finds us. Maybe you can stop it. Maybe you can figure out what this is before it spreads. But whatever you do, don't dig here. Don't disturb what lies beneath. Infestation. It started with a strange smell, something rotten, decaying, hidden somewhere in the walls. I'd noticed it about a week after moving into my new apartment. At first I thought it was just an old building thing, maybe a clogged pipe or some leftover food stuck somewhere in the ventilation system. But it didn't go away. It got worse. The smell wasn't the only thing. I started hearing things too. Soft skittering sounds coming from the kitchen at night. The first few times I dismissed it as the wind rattling the old windows, but then it got louder, much louder. It was like something was moving through the walls, something that scratched and scurried. That's when I saw the first roach. I was making coffee one morning, bleary-eyed and half asleep, when I saw it crawling across the counter. The sight of it jolted me awake, its shiny brown body glistening in the light. I grabbed a napkin, crushed it, and threw it in the trash. Gross, but no big deal. It's just one cockroach, right? I was wrong. The next day, there were more. Dozens, crawling out of the cracks in the walls, emerging from the cupboards, swarming over the countertops. I spent hours that night with a can of bug spray, chasing them down one by one. But no matter how many I killed, more kept coming. It was like the entire building was infested, and they weren't normal cockroaches either. They moved faster, almost deliberately, like they knew I was hunting them. By the third day, the infestation was unbearable. I couldn't cook, I couldn't sleep. The roaches were everywhere. I'd wake up in the middle of the night feeling something crawling across my skin, only to throw back the covers and see them swarming across the bed. No matter how many I killed, it wasn't enough. They just kept coming, pouring out of the walls like a living tide. I called the landlord, but he didn't seem too concerned. "It's an old building," he said over the phone. "These things happen." "They're not normal roaches," I told him, but he just laughed it off. "Call an exterminator," he said, as if that was going to solve the problem. I did call an exterminator. He came the next morning, a big guy with a no-nonsense attitude. He took one look at the place and whistled. "That's a lot of roaches," he muttered, pulling on his gloves. "Never seen 'em come out in the daylight like this." He sprayed the place down, muttering about nests and chemicals, but even he seemed spooked by the sheer number of bugs crawling out of the cracks. "Should do the trick," he said after a couple of hours, wiping sweat from his brow. "But if they come back, give me a call." I hoped that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. That night, things got worse. I was sitting in the living room, exhausted and on edge, when I heard it again. That skittering sound. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the ceiling. I looked up, my heart pounding. There, just above the light fixture, I could see them. Hundreds of roaches crawling through the cracks in the ceiling, their tiny legs scraping against the plaster. I froze, too terrified to move. Then, slowly, they started to fall. One by one, they dropped from the ceiling like rain, landing on the floor, the furniture, and, oh God, on me. I leapt to my feet, swatting at them, my skin crawling with disgust. I grabbed a broom and started sweeping them off me, smashing them against the floor, but no matter how many I killed, more kept falling. The entire apartment was swarming with them, the air thick with the smell of decay. That's when I noticed something else. Amidst the chaos, I saw one of the roaches, larger than the others, crawl across the floor toward me. It stopped a few feet away, just watching. Its antennae twitched, and for a moment I could have sworn it was looking directly at me, like it was studying me, observing. I stepped back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The roach didn't move, it just sat there, its glossy shell catching the dim light, its eyes, those black, unblinking eyes, fixed on me. I don't know why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to run. I turned and bolted for the door, flinging it open and rushing into the hallway. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, and I collapsed against the wall, shaking, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard the voices. They were faint at first, like whispers on the wind, but they grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable. Cold, calculating, inhuman, and they were coming from my apartment. I stood there frozen, my heart hammering in my chest as the skittering sound grew louder. It wasn't just in the walls anymore, it was in the air, in the floor beneath my feet. I could feel it, vibrating through the entire building. The roaches were everywhere, and then the door slammed shut behind me. I don't remember how long I stood in the hallway staring at the door, my mind racing with fear. The voices, the skittering, the smell, they were all inside waiting for me. I didn't dare go back in. I left that night. I didn't take anything with me. I just got in my car and drove as far away from that building as I could. I didn't tell anyone about the roaches or the voices. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my new apartment, I hear them again. The faint sound of skittering in the walls, the soft whispers just out of earshot. And I know they're still watching, waiting. The Man Who Watched. Everyone in the small town of Westfield knew Mr. Garrett. He was a quiet man, always keeping to himself, living in the same old house at the end of Willow Street. The kind of man you'd see walking to the grocery store or sitting on his porch, smoking a cigarette, watching the world pass by. No one thought much of him. To most, he was just another retired old-timer. But I knew better. I had seen the man for what he really was. And now I can't sleep. Not after everything I've uncovered. It started when I moved into town a few months ago. I was fresh out of a job and looking for a quiet place to land while I figured out my next move. Westfield seemed perfect. Small, peaceful, and away from the noise of the city. I rented a small house just a block away from Mr. Garrett's. I'd see him every day, sitting on his porch, staring into the distance with a cigarette always hanging from his lips. There was something unsettling about the way he watched everything. Silent, expressionless. At first, I thought he was just an old man with too much time on his hands. But then, I started noticing things. He always knew when something was happening before anyone else did. One day, a house caught fire on the other side of town, and by the time the fire department arrived, Garrett was already standing at the scene, staring at the flames like he'd known it would happen. A week later, when a car accident killed a local couple, I saw him at the crash site, standing there with the same unreadable expression. It was more than just coincidence. He was always there, watching. One evening, as I was walking past his house, curiosity got the better of me. I slowed down, glancing at him as he sat there on his porch, smoke curling from his cigarette. He didn't look at me, but I felt his gaze, even from behind his dark sunglasses. I couldn't explain it, but something about him unnerved me. I began to wonder who this man really was. He had no family that I knew of, no friends, and no one in town seemed to know much about him. So I started digging. I wasn't prepared for what I found. Mr. Garrett didn't exist. Not officially, at least. His name wasn't in any local records, no birth certificate, no social security. I asked around town, but no one could tell me when he had moved to Westfield. He had always just been there like a fixture of the town itself. The more I searched, the more questions I had. I started to wonder if he was some kind of government spook, a retired intelligence officer maybe. The idea wasn't that far-fetched, especially considering the way he always seemed to know things before they happened. Then one night everything changed. It was late and I was working in my small home office reviewing some of the old articles I had found on Mr. Garrett. There wasn't much, just a few passing mentions in local news stories, usually about tragic events in town. He was always in the background, a nameless observer. But as I scrolled through the articles, I noticed something chilling. In every photo, every single one, Garrett was there. Not just in Westfield, but in other towns, other places. He hadn't aged in decades. The photos spanned nearly 40 years, yet his appearance was exactly the same, always sitting in the background watching. Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. Mr. Garrett wasn't just a man. He was something else, something that had been around for much longer than anyone could remember. I don't know what compelled me to go to his house that night, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to confront him, had to know what he was. I grabbed my coat and headed out into the night, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, the porch was dark and Garrett wasn't there. For the first time since I'd moved to town, the house seemed empty. But as I stepped closer, I saw a faint light flickering inside through the front window. I hesitated, then knocked on the door. No answer. My pulse raced as I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I tried the handle, it was unlocked. The door creaked open and I stepped inside. The smell of cigarette smoke hung thick in the air, and the interior was dimly lit by a single lamp in the living room. The house was small, barely furnished, with old yellowed wallpaper peeling from the walls. I called out his name, but the only response was the soft ticking of an old clock on the mantel. My stomach twisted as I ventured deeper into the house. There was something wrong here, something deeply unsettling. That's when I saw it, his study. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack I could see the glow of a television. I pushed the door open, and what I saw inside nearly made me collapse. The room was filled with monitors, dozens of them, stacked on shelves covering every wall. Each one displayed live feeds from cameras all over town. The streets, the stores, people's homes, even my house. He had been watching us, watching me. I stumbled backward, horrified, but that's when I heard it. The soft creak of floorboards behind me. I turned slowly, and there he was. Mr. Garrett stood in the doorway, cigarette hanging from his lips, his face as calm as ever. "I knew you'd come," he said quietly, his voice eerily calm. "You've been digging. That's dangerous." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Why?" I finally managed to whisper. "Why are you watching us?" Garrett took a slow drag of his cigarette, exhaling the smoke with a sigh. "It's not about watching," he said. "It's about control." His eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, bore into mine, and for the first time, I saw something behind them. Something ancient. Something that had been there far longer than I could comprehend. "You'll forget all of this by morning," he said almost gently. "It's better that way." And then the world went black. I woke up in my own bed the next morning, the events of the night before hazy in my mind. It felt like a dream, a nightmare I couldn't quite shake. But when I looked outside, I saw him again. Mr. Garrett sitting on his porch smoking a cigarette, watching. The Feast of Silence. My name is Sam Wheeler, and I've lived in Boise, Idaho, my whole life. Not exactly the most exciting place, but it's home. I work as a delivery driver for a meat distribution company that supplies small towns all over the state. It's a straightforward job, nothing special, but the pay's decent, and the hours are flexible enough to keep me sane. About 2 weeks ago, I got an assignment to deliver a shipment to a tiny town called Prosper. I'd never heard of the place before, and considering how much I've traveled around Idaho, that was unusual. It was one of those spots so far off the map you'd think it didn't exist, but the order was legit. 50 pounds of high-quality meat, mostly beef and chicken, sent by a local restaurant called The Harvest Feast. Seemed routine at the time, just another job, but nothing about that trip was normal. Prosper was about a 3-hour drive from Boise, and it wasn't on any GPS system I could find. I had to use a paper map, the kind that's been folded 1,000 times and barely legible at this point. After winding through narrow roads and thick pine forests, I finally reached the town. It was strange. There were maybe 24 buildings, most of them small houses or shacks, with a diner and a general store making up the town center. Everything about the place felt stuck in the past, like it hadn't moved forward in decades. No cell service, no radio stations, not even a gas station. Just the heavy, oppressive silence hanging in the air. I pulled up to the Harvest Feast, the restaurant that had ordered the meat. It was a squat wooden building with a faded sign above the door. Looked like the kind of place that hadn't been renovated since the 1960s. A few cars were parked out front, but there were no customers inside when I walked in. An old man was standing behind the counter, wiping down glasses. He had gray hair, a lined face, and a pair of pale blue eyes that seemed too sharp for someone his age. He introduced himself as Henry, the owner. "You the delivery driver?" he asked, eyeing the boxes of meat I was bringing in. "Yeah," I said, setting them down by the door. "Got your shipment here. Beef and chicken, right?" He nodded but didn't seem particularly interested. "Good. We've got a big event tonight." I waited for him to sign the receipt, but something about the place made me uneasy. The whole restaurant was dimly lit, the windows covered with heavy curtains that blocked out most of the daylight. The air inside felt thick, like the place hadn't been aired out in years. Henry glanced at me. "You hungry?" "No, I'm good," I lied. "I've got a lot of deliveries today." "Shame," he said. "We've got a special dish tonight. Only comes around once a year. You'd be lucky to try it." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I shook my head. "Maybe next time." Henry just smiled, that strange, sharp smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Suit yourself." I left as quickly as I could, but the whole drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The way Henry talked, the way the town seemed so isolated, so cut off from everything. It was like they were hiding something. That night I couldn't sleep. The air in my apartment felt stifling, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Henry's face, smiling at me from behind the counter. I didn't know why, but the thought of the harvest feast in that town gnawed at me, kept me awake. So I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I went back. The next day I called in sick, packed up my truck, and drove back to Prosper. I don't know what I was expecting to find, maybe some explanation, maybe just to satisfy my curiosity. But what I found was so much worse. When I got to the town, it was deserted. No people, no cars, nothing. The streets were empty, the windows of the buildings dark. It was like everyone had just vanished. I parked in front of the harvest feast and got out of the truck. The restaurant looked exactly the same as the day before, but now there was a strange, rancid smell coming from inside. I pushed open the door, and the first thing that hit me was the heat. The place was sweltering, the air thick with the stench of rotting meat. The tables were set, plates of food laid out, but the food was untouched, left to spoil. Flies buzzed around the plates, and that same foul odor hung heavy in the air. I felt sick. "Hello?" I called, but there was no answer. That's when I saw the door in the back, slightly ajar. The smell was coming from there. My gut told me to leave, to turn around and never come back, but I had to know what was going on. I pushed the door open and stepped into the back room. It was dark, lit only by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. And in the center of the room, there was a long wooden table. On the table were cuts of meat, raw and bloody, arranged like some kind of grotesque feast. But it wasn't just beef or chicken. There were human remains on that table, limbs, torsos, pieces of flesh, all laid out as if they were preparing for a meal. My stomach turned and I stumbled back, my heart racing, bile rising in my throat. Then I heard it, a low murmur like a chant coming from beneath the floor. There was a trap door at the far end of the room, slightly open. The sound was coming from down there. I should have run. I should have gotten back in my truck and driven as far away from that place as possible. But something pulled me toward that trap door. Maybe it was the same thing that had driven me back to Prosper in the first place. Maybe I just needed to know. I knelt down and lifted the trap door. Below there was a staircase leading down into darkness. The chanting was louder now, more distinct. I could hear voices, many voices, murmuring in unison. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs. The basement was vast, much larger than the restaurant above. The walls were made of old stone, damp and covered in moss. And at the far end of the room, there was a group of people, dozens of them, standing in a circle around a fire. They were dressed in dark robes, their faces hidden in shadow, chanting in that same low murmur I had heard before. In the center of the circle, on a stone altar, was a body, a man. He wasn't moving. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and one of the robed figures stepped forward, holding a long, curved knife. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't stay there. I had to get out. But as I turned to leave, one of the figures at the edge of the circle looked up. It was Henry. He saw me. His eyes locked on mine, and he smiled that same sharp smile. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the basement or how I made it back to my truck. The next thing I knew, I was driving out of Prosper as fast as I could, my hands shaking, my mind racing. When I reached Boise, I went straight to the police. I told them everything, about the meat, the basement, the people in the robes. But when they went to investigate, there was nothing. No bodies, no people, no sign of anything strange. Just an empty restaurant and a quiet town. They told me it was probably my imagination, maybe some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But I know what I saw. I know what's happening in Prosper. They're still out there. And whatever they're doing, whatever they're eating, it's not over. The fortune teller's curse. I never believed in fate. I always figured life was what you made of it, that your choices defined your path. But last week, that belief was shattered. It started on a rainy evening, one of those late nights where the world feels heavier, like it's pressing down on you with its weight. I was driving down the highway, lost in thought, when I saw it. A small, run-down building just off the road. The neon sign in the window flickered. Fortune teller. I don't know why I pulled over. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in psychic readings or horoscopes. But something drew me in. Maybe it was the rain, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something more. Either way, I found myself stepping inside, greeted by the musty smell of incense and the dim glow of candles. The fortune teller was an old man, his face weathered and lined with age. He didn't speak as I sat down at the table across from him. Instead, he took out a small, tarnished coin and began flipping it through his fingers, watching me with sharp, piercing eyes. "You're here about your future," he finally said, his voice low and raspy. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I half expected him to start with some vague nonsense, something about love or success. Instead, he just stared at me, flipping the coin faster now. "You can't outrun it," he said after a long silence. "Fate is coming for you." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He held up the coin, letting it catch the light. "You've already set things in motion. The choices you've made, they can't be undone." A chill ran down my spine. "Are you saying something bad is going to happen?" He flipped the coin one last time and let it fall onto the table. It landed heads up, revealing a strange symbol etched into the surface. I didn't recognize it, but it gave me a sinking feeling in my gut. "Death," he said simply. "It's coming for you." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping in. "Come on, man. I'm not buying this." But the fortune teller didn't smile. He leaned in, his eyes locked on mine. "It doesn't matter if you believe it. It's already begun." I left the place feeling stupid for even walking in. But as I drove away, something shifted. A sense of dread settled over me like a storm cloud, and over the next few days, things only got worse. It started with the dreams, vivid, nightmarish visions of my own death. In every one of them, I saw the same scene: shattered glass, blood, and the reflection of that strange symbol on the coin. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then the visions started happening while I was awake. I'd be going about my day, driving, working, even just sitting at home, and suddenly I'd see it. Flashes of the accident, the sound of screeching tires, the sensation of impact, the blood. It felt so real, like I was living it over and over again. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I had to confront the fortune teller, to find out if there was any way to stop what was coming. I drove back to the small building off the highway, my hands shaking on the wheel. But when I arrived, the place was gone. Not just closed, but completely vanished, as if it had never been there at all. The lot was empty, the sign gone. The building itself reduced to a patch of dead grass. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I turned to leave, but something stopped me. A glint on the ground near where the building had stood. Crouching down, I saw a small, tarnished coin half buried in the dirt. As I picked it up, a strange sensation coursed through me, like a jolt of electricity. It wasn't just any coin. It was the same one the fortune teller had been playing with during our reading. I turned the coin over in my hand, staring at the strange symbol etched into it. It wasn't anything I recognized, but it felt ancient, powerful. I suddenly felt dizzy, the world around me spinning. I steadied myself against the car, clutching the coin tightly, and the visions returned. Flashes of my death, the broken glass, the blood. But this time, something was different. In the vision, I wasn't lying still. I was moving, fighting against the inevitable. And in the reflection of a broken shard of glass, I saw the same symbol that was on the coin. I snapped back to reality, my heart pounding. The visions weren't warnings, they were clues. I got into my car and sped home, my mind racing. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had been given a second chance. Something about the coin had changed everything. The feeling of doom that had been hanging over me for the past week began to lift, replaced by a strange sense of clarity. The fortune teller hadn't cursed me. He had given me a way out. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the coin resting in front of me. I studied the symbol, trying to decipher its meaning, but the harder I thought, the more elusive it seemed. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I fell asleep at the table, the coin still clutched in my hand. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No more whispers, no more visions. I felt normal. The sense of impending doom that had haunted me was gone, replaced by a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. I don't know how or why, but I was alive and I was free. The fortune teller had been right. I couldn't outrun fate. But maybe, just maybe, I could change it. As the days passed, the coin became a reminder, a talisman of sorts. I kept it with me everywhere I went, always tucked in my pocket. The visions never returned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they might one day, and if they did, I would be ready. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows once again. If tonight's stories made you feel like you're not alone in the dark, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear if you've ever had a moment where you felt something watching you. If you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you're always the first to hear what's lurking just out of sight. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, the unknown is always closer than you think.